and imperfect, right? So labor market is divided in two categories: perfect and imperfect labor markets. Now, what's the difference? Perfect labor market has four characteristics. Let me repeat those, right? So there are a couple of firms that are willing to hire people, and there are a couple of number of people who are willing to work, right? They are looking for jobs. So that's the first one. So there are a lot of firms hiring people. So there's a lot of demand for labor, and there are a lot of people who are willing to work, which means there's also a lot of supply of labor, right? Then the second characteristic of perfect labor market is that firms are wage takers. Now, what that means exactly is that the market wages are based on labor demand and labor supply. So to quickly recap this, if you remember yesterday, I made this diagram where we saw that the total demand for labor and total supply of labor determine equilibrium wages, and where demand and supply intersect, that's equilibrium wage, and that will determine how much each worker will be paid in that market, right? So upward sloping is supply, downward sloping is demand, right? And then you have, right, where the two intersect, that would be your equilibrium wage, right? So this would be your equilibrium wage. Now what happens is that each worker will be paid this much. Now what you need to do next is that each firm cannot hire anyone less than this wage, right? So what you'll do is you'll extend this line, right? You'll extend this wage rate forward to the next graph, which is for the firm, right? So the next graph that I'm making is for the firm, right? Now it will be a straight horizontal, it will be a straight horizontal line. So this is supply of labor, right? So this is supply of labor for one firm, supply of labor for one firm. So this graph on the right is for the firm, and the one on the left is for the market, right? Easy. Okay. Now, how many people would each firm hire? So that is where the demand for labor intersects with the supply. Have a look at this. So this straight horizontal, just give me a second. So, right. So the downward sloping demand curve goes like this. I mean, it's a little hassle to draw it without that thing, but you do get the idea. Okay, have a look at this. So this straight horizontal line is the supply of labor for one firm, right? And this downward sloping demand curve, which I will label as DL, this is the demand for labor, right? Now, where the demand and supply for labor for one firm intersect, that will determine the quantity of labor that this firm will hire, right? So let's say this firm is hiring 10 units of labor, and the total number of people employed in the industry or in the market is how much? Let's say 100 people. Are you getting me? So what we saw here, that each firm is wage taker. What do we mean by wage taker? That whatever wages are set through the market forces, of total supply for labor and the total demand for labor, that will be the equilibrium wage, and each firm will hire the people at this wage rate. So whatever this wage rate is, each firm has to hire at this wage rate. Why? Because if you offer them something less, right, people will not work for you because they have other options available, right? Correct? Okay. Now coming to the supply, what determines labor supply, right? So talking about labor supply, have a look at this. So labor supply is basically, let me share the screen, right? So labor supply, just give me a second. Let me open my notes here. Right. So labor supply captures, first we'll talk about individual labor supply, and then we'll talk about market supply of labor, right? So just like there's individual or one firm demand for labor, and then there's market demand for labor, similarly, there is individual supply of labor, and then there's market supply of labor. Are you following me, Abdullah? If at any point you feel confused or lost, please ask me, right? Okay, now think about this. Individual labor supply, let me first copy this question here, right? Okay, so this is the question we are doing. And can you see my screen? Okay, now we are still doing the A part of this question, right? The market supply of labor shows total number of people who are willing to work at different rates, right? Next thing that you need to tell here is that market supply of labor is made up of individual labor is made up of individual labor supply curves. Is this making sense? Okay. Now the idea is, right. Sure. I'll share both the AS and the A2 notes with you, right? You don't need to worry about that. Okay. Now the market supply of labor shows the total number of people who are willing to work at different wage rates. Market supply of labor is made up of individual labor supply curves, right? Now we'll look at two things here. We'll look at the individual labor supply curve, and then we'll look at the market supply of labor. Now talking about the individual, have a look at this, right? Talking about the individual labor supply curves. Okay. Now the idea is, have a look at this. The idea is that on the y-axis, you will have wage rate, right? And on the x-axis, you will have the number of hours. Now we're talking about individual labor supply. So you have wage rate, like how much wage rate is being paid. And then on the x-axis, you have number of hours, right? Okay, number of hours that someone is willing to work. So if I'm making this individual labor supply curve for myself, then what I'm actually capturing is that at a certain wage rate, how many hours in a day I would want to work, or how many hours in a week I would want to work. Is this making sense? Right? Okay, now have a look at this. Now, individual labor supply curve, you might find it a little, surprising to see that the shape goes like this, but it's upward sloping to some part, and then it's backward bending. Now, why does it slope upwards? I'll explain you first that part, and then I'll explain you that why does it bend backwards. Now, the upward sloping part should be very simple and obvious, right? So have a look at this, Abdullah. So if I'm being paid, let's say $10 per hour, right? If anyone is, let's say, being paid $10 or $12 an hour, right? So at this, which is the minimum wage in most countries, by the way, you might know, right? In USA, $10 per hour is the minimum wage. So this is the lowest someone can earn, right? So let's say with that wage rate, someone is willing to work 10 hours per day, right? Fair enough. But what if the wage rate per hour is increased? So then this person will move from point A to point B. With higher wage rate, the person will be motivated to work for longer hours. Do you agree with me? Right? Do you agree with me? Right? So with greater number of hours, with the higher wage rate, that person would be encouraged to work for 20 would be too much, right? So let's say that person might be encouraged to work for longer hours, like 15 hours per day or whatever, right? And so on. So up till this wage rate where there's a bend, the person is willing to work for longer hours when the wage rate increases. Yes or no, right? So up till this part, up till this wage rate, right, could be anything, $20 an hour or whatever, right? So the more the wage rate, the more the hours this person wants to work, right? But after this, what will happen? Now think about this. Since you are earning more per hour already, right? So if someone is working more hours already, earning more per hour already, right? Why would you want to work for longer hours, given your total compensation is increasing, right? Now let's do a real life calculation so that you can understand what happens in this case, right? So let's say if for 18 hours per day, someone is earning $20, right? So 20 times 18 is how much? So you do the maths, 20 times 18 is, so if someone is operating at this point, right? So let's label it as C. So this person would be earning 18 twos are 36, so $360 per day. Is it making sense, Abdullah, right? Now, if I choose another point, which is on the backward bending part of the curve, here you can see for yourself that your wage rate would be higher, but you are willing to work for lesser number of hours, right? You're willing to work for lesser number of hours, right? So let's say at this, you are only with $22 per hour, this person is only willing to work for 16 hours per day, right? Now, think about this. 16 times 22 would be how much? Right? So 16 times 22, 22 times 16 is, right? Let me do this on my calculator, right? So 16 times 22 would be 352, right? So if I slightly modify my example here, right? So let's say it's not $20 per hour, it's $25 per hour, right? Now, when I do this 25 times 16, that will give me a number bigger than 360. Are you getting me? So 25 times 16 would be definitely 25 times 16 is 400, right? So with lesser number of hours, you are earning more. So why would you want to work for longer hours? This is making sense, right? You choose leisure time over working hours if the wage rate per hour increases. Absolutely excellent, right? So up till this part, up till this wage rate, Abdullah, up till this wage rate, what was true? There was substitution effect. So substitution effect says that higher the wage rate, higher the hours or longer the hours someone wants to work, right? Is it making sense? Right? So let me now write what we just saw on the graph. Individual labor supply curve shows the number of hours someone is willing to work at certain wage rate. Actually, the curve slopes upwards, and after a certain wage rate, it starts to bend backwards, right? Uh, for the upward sloping part, substitution effect is stronger, meaning someone would longer hours with increase with increase in wage rate and vice versa. And the uh, backward bending part, the income effect is stronger, meaning the individual prefers, sorry about this constant, right? So for the backward bending part, the income effect is stronger, meaning individual prefers, as you said, leisure time over work, given he, she already work in total with right? Is it simple, right? Okay. Now, this being said, now think about this. So we have already talked about individual labor supply. Now, the next thing that we're about to discuss here is that what is labor supply, market labor supply made up of, right? So as I said, market labor supply shows the number of people. In fact, I did write this over here. The market supply of labor shows the total number of people who are willing to work at different wage rate. Market supply of labor is made up of individual supply curves, right? Now, what do I mean by that? So what you do horizontal summation. Horizontal summation, right? So let me also write it down over here, what we also saw for the demand curve yesterday. And also I'll show you in a bit on the graph how it looks like. With horizontal summation of individual supply curves, we extract the market supply curve, right? Okay, now have a look at this. Now, what you need to do to extract the market supply curve, have a look at this. So let's say, obviously, this will be a little unrealistic assumption, but let's assume there are three people who supply a certain type of labor, right? So there are only three people who are qualified to work as a, let's say, nuclear scientist, right? So let's choose something which is very unique. So there are only three people in Pakistan who are qualified enough to work as nuclear scientists. Okay, now think about this. So these are the three supply curves, right? So this is for individual 3, let's label it as S3. This is for individual 2, let's label it as S2. And this is for individual 1, so let's label it as S1. Easy, we good on this? Okay. Now the market supply would comprise of these three. Now what you need to do is to, just like we did yesterday for the demand part, demand curve, right? At a certain wage rate, let's say at W1, what is the total number of hours or the total number of people who are willing to work at this wage rate, right? So the first person, let's say, is willing to work 10 hours. The first person is willing to work 10 hours per day, right, with this wage rate. The second person is perhaps willing to work 15 hours per day, and the third person is willing to work 18 hours per day, right? Now, at this wage rate, you add up the hours of work that each of these three individuals are willing to work, which makes it 10, 15, 25, 25, and 18 is 40 and 48, right? So the total number of hours someone would be willing to work at this wage rate, right? Sorry, the total supply of labor in the market at this wage rate would be how many hours? 48 hours. Is this making sense, right? And similarly, you can do it for another wage rate, right? So let's say if we choose a higher wage rate, right, then this first person is willing to work, let's say, somewhat, you know, let's choose it over here. Are you getting the point, Abdullah? Right? So at this wage rate, let's say this person is willing to work 14 hours, right? 14 hours. And then the second employee is willing to work, let's say, 16 hours, right? And then the third person is willing to work, let's say, 19 hours, right? So you add the total number of hours these people are willing to work at these different wage rates, and that will give you the total number of hours that are available in the market, right? So whatever that is. And then let's say this is adding up to, I'm not doing the calculation, but let's say this is adding up to 55. And then you just draw a straight upward sloping line, and that will be your market supply of labor. So you label it as market supply of labor. Is making sense? Abdullah, any confusion so far? Anything that's not clear? Right? Good on this? Okay. So coming back to the point, let's summarize everything that we have discussed so far. So the question was asking you discuss how wage rates are determined in perfect market. So you start off by defining what perfect market is. You'll list all the characteristics that there are a couple of firms that are willing to hire, and there are a number of firms who are willing to work. So there is a lot of demand and a lot of supply of labor services. The second characteristic of perfect labor market is that the firms are wage takers. What do we mean by wage takers? That whatever wage is prevailing in the market based on the market demand and market supply, that is the wage at which each firm will hire labor. That's the second characteristic. The third one was that labor has homogeneous skills, which means that no matter which person you hire, more or less his or her skill set will be same. And the last of all was that labor is occupationally and geographically mobile, right? So that means that labor can switch between different occupations and different cities and countries, right? So that is what you'll say. Then you have to explain the labor demand. So market demand for labor is made up of individual firms' demand for labor. Market demand for labor is made up of individual firms' demand for labor. And how do individual firms demand labor? So that is based on their marginal revenue product of labor, that entire thing that we discussed. So when you horizontally add up individual firms' demand for labor, that gives you the market demand for labor. Then similarly, you'll explain the supply of labor. So what is labor supply? Labor supply is basically the number of hours that someone is willing to work at different wage rates. So that is individual labor supply. When you add up individual labor supply curves, you get the market supply of labor. Is this making sense? Is everything clear so far, Abdullah? So this is what you will explain in this question. And then in the end, you will draw the upward sloping market supply of labor, downward sloping market demand for labor, where the two are equal. That would be your equilibrium point. This is your equilibrium point that shows you how much would each person earn and what will be the total quantity of people employed in the market. Easy? You good? Okay. Now let's keep moving forward and let's attempt the second question. If the labor market is imperfect, is the determination of wage rate still better left to that market? If the labor market is imperfect, is the determination of wage rate still better left to that market? Now, this is the question that we will attempt. Okay. Now, first of all, you need to define what imperfect labor market is. Define imperfect market, right? Now, what is imperfect labor market? So have a look at this. Imperfect labor market is when, due to external factors like government intervention, trade unions, right? Or to due to let's put it in this way. Imperfect labor market is when due to presence of factors like government intervention, existence of trade unions, or or uh, monopsony, the wage rates are not solely determined by market forces of demand and supply, and instead they are dependent on other factors. Okay, have a look at this. So, Abdullah, what did we say? So the question was saying that if the labor market is imperfect, so we are assuming that there's an imperfect labor market, it says that is it still better that the wage rates are are better left to the market, so the government does not interfere and those are left by whatever the market is deciding, right? Now what did I say here? That imperfect labor market is, first of all, you need to define, is when due to presence of factors like government intervention, existence of trade unions, or monopsony, the wage rate the wage rates are not solely determined by market force of demand supply, and instead they are dependent on other factors, right? Okay, now let's discuss each one of these one by one, that what happens when each of these factors exist. Now firstly, talking about government intervention. Government might intervene in labor markets to achieve more stable outcome through policies like minimum wages, right? Um, right? Policies like minimum wages, uh, uh, labor laws regarding working conditions, etc. Right? Okay. Now, first of all, what you have explained over here, that government might intervene in labor markets to achieve a more equitable outcome through policies like minimum wages, labor laws regarding working conditions, and all that. Now, what would that do? When government intervenes, Abdullah, you follow me? It makes such policies, then the cost of hiring labor increases, and would that would do what? That would right decrease the demand for labor. Okay, have a look at this. So when government intervenes in labor markets, and government, obviously, what's the government objective? So the government objective is to achieve more equitable outcome, right? So government want everyone to at least earn a basic minimum wage, and they should have decent working conditions, and government wants to implement labor laws and all those things. Now when government imposes such things, it increases the cost of hiring. Now labor becomes more expensive because you not only need to pay them well, you also need to do them what, right? You also need to provide them with other facilities and working conditions and all those things, right? With that happening, the cost of hiring labor has increased. Now how would companies respond to that, right? So companies would respond to those things by reducing their demand, because now labor is not as labor is not as what's that called, productive, or it's not contributing as much to the revenue, because whatever revenue it contributes, there is also some amount spent towards providing the facilities like better working conditions and minimum wages and all those things, right? With that thing happening, right, so the demand for labor decreases, and with that it would negatively eventually your demand for labor would adversely affect employment levels. Do you agree with me? Right? Alhamdulillah. So it would negatively affect your employment levels. Now that's a problem here, right? So we just said that government intervention is not always beneficial. Why? Because government, now first of all, we explained how government intervenes by providing, by making rules like minimum wages and improved working conditions and all that, which might be really good for the workers. Obviously they are, but they increase the cost of labor for firms. And when that happens, they reduce the demand for labor. And with that thing happening, right, what would that do? That would negatively affect employment levels, like the number of people employed in that country or industry would decrease, right? So that's perhaps not a very good outcome. Secondly, what about trade unions? Right, that's correct. So again, that's what I'm saying, right? So when government intervenes and government, make laws that if there is any case of, labor exploitation or so on and so forth, they will, you know, impose penalties, and they will fine those companies. Then again, that is increasing, all of this is increasing your cost of hiring labor, right? So companies in turn will want to hire less number of people, right? Okay, now what are trade unions? So first of all, we'll explain trade unions are group of platforms that represent workers belonging to certain firm, industry, or sector, right? Now, trade unions are basically, okay, now that's a good question, Abdullah. So, I mean, not always. Sometimes it's a company specific trade union. So if I say Toyota Workers Association, so anyone who's working within that one company, Toyota, only their employees would be part of that union, right? But sometimes it's also industry specific, right? So auto industry, auto workers association. So then in that case, when you're working in the auto, anyone who's working in the auto sector, whether that be Honda, Toyota, whatever, all of these are auto companies. So all those employees would be part of that, right? Petrol pumps, yeah, correct. So I mean, there are different types of trade unions. Sometimes they are um, firm specific, sometimes they're industry specific, and so on. Right? Is it making sense? So that's what you need to understand. Okay, if we are good, we'll move on. Right? Okay. Now, when you have defined belonging to a certain firm, industry, or sector, right? The next thing that you need to write here is trade unions collectively bargain employers for their for their for the rights of their members, and therefore would take industrial action in case their demands are not being met, to pressurize firms, pressurize the firm employer to accept their demands. Okay, now have a look at this. Now, we have explained so far that what is trade union and how do trade unions operate, right? So trade unions are organizations platform that represents workers in a certain sector or firm and so on. Now, the objective of trade union is to protect the rights of their members, right? So all the workers who are their members, it's trade union's responsibility to protect their it's their job to protect the rights of their members. Now, what they do in case their demands are not being met, right? So I think I added it in the wrong right? So if in case their demands are not being met, what will trade union do? They will take industrial action. Now you need to know what industrial action is. You might have heard the word for the first time, you would obviously, but you would know what exactly what exactly industrial action means. It means that to pressurize industry when a trade union relies on strike, protest, or any other form of form of uh, right uh, uh, what should be the word, form of bargaining to get their demands met, right? So what exactly is industrial action? So industrial action is when workers go on a strike or protest because their demands are not being met and they are trying to pressurize the firm or the employer to accept their demands. Now, what happens in that case? Again, the problem with trade union is that trade unions increase they increase the cost of labor. Right now, it becomes more expensive to hire labor because they're asking for higher wages, they're asking for better working conditions, and so on and so forth. Then what will that do? With increased cost, firms likely to demand less labor and instead try to replace labor with what? With capital. Yes or no? This is making sense. So the two factors of inputs, capital and labor, are substitutes with each other. So if labor costs are increasing, what would the firm do? The firm would want to substitute labor with capital, right? Yes or no? So again, that would negatively affect the employment levels. So again, as the question is saying, if the labor market is imperfect, is the determination of wage rates still better left to that market? So in this case, you would say perhaps the wage rates will be better for the workers, but the problem is that the employment levels will be negatively affected. So there's one good side to it and one bad side to it. Abdullah, are you getting me? So the wage determination would be in favor of whom? If it's a trade union, then the wage rates will be higher and the wage rates would be in favor of the workers. But that would mean lesser employment overall because companies would want to hire less labor. Yes or no? Okay, is this making sense? Right now, okay, yeah, sure, I can repeat that. Now, what I was saying here is, Abdullah, that the question was saying, look at the question. If the labor market is imperfect, is the determination of wage rates still better left to that market? Which means that the government doesn't take any role, and if it's an imperfect market due to any reason, whether it's because of government intervention or it's because of trade unions or it's because of monopoly, so it says that if the labor market is imperfect, is the determination of wage rate still better left to that market, right? So basically it's trying to ask you that what would be the outcome, right? What would be the outcome if it's an imperfect market, and who would be on the winning end and who would be on the losing end and all those things, right? Now, coming back to the point, right? So what you need to say, first of all, just like we explained it for the government intervention. So in the case of government intervention, we said that when government intervenes, they make minimum wages, they impose minimum wages, they impose, labor laws and all those things. That increases the cost of labor, right? So now it's more expensive to hire labor and all that. So how would companies respond to it? Companies would, even though it will benefit workers because their wages would be increasing and all that, but since the cost of hiring labor increases, firms would want to replace labor with whom? They would want to replace labor with, they'll want to replace labor with machines, right? So overall employment levels in that market will be affected, or overall in the economy, employment levels will be affected. So that's a negative thing. Similarly, What happens in the case of trade union? So first you explain what trade union is and how trade unions operate. So you said that these are organizations who work for the rights of their workers, who are their members. Now, trade unions are doing the same thing as the government intervention was. Right, that's correct. That's correct. Abdullah, that's correct. I mean, that's not something that all firms can afford, have to pay the minimum wage. Absolutely, that's correct. That's a very good observation. But still, even small firms might start thinking about how to replace labor with machines. So I'll give you a very simple example. If there is a shop, right? So if there is a shop, normal retail shop where you go and you buy goods and everything, previously they might have 4 5 cashiers, right? They used to, collect cash manually, and they had a couple of cashiers at the desk to collect cash and to count the items. But then after that they might get that thing, what's that called, the barcode scanner or reader. With that thing, right, what will that do? That will reduce the demand for labor. Now that's not a very expensive equipment, that's not a very expensive tool to have. But again, with that thing purchased, now the demand for labor is less. You don't need 5 or 6 cashiers. Perhaps one cashier would be good enough to, to collect the cash and all that, right? Are you getting me? So to some extent that would be true even for small firms, but yeah, for larger firms it's much easier to replace labor with capital because they have more finance and they can buy expensive machines and all that. Easy, we're good on this. Okay, so for both the cases, government intervention and trade unions, the workers are benefiting to some extent, that they're getting higher wages, but they're also at a disadvantage because the overall employment levels are decreasing. Because the overall employment levels are decreasing. Is it making sense? Right? We good? Okay. Now moving on to the last part, and that's monopsony. Right, great. Monopsony is, so basically think about it. Monopsony is single employer in a region or market, right? Nothing about this. Sometimes there is only one firm that can hire a certain type of labor. Now you might be thinking that how is that even possible, right? So if you think about doctors, there are so many hospitals that are willing to hire doctors. If you think of teachers, there's so many schools who are willing to hire teachers and so on and so forth, right? But how come there could be only one firm that is, capable of hiring a certain type of labor? And that is what monopsony is. So now let me define you what exactly that means. So monopsony is a single employer in a region or market, which means that it is the only employer for a certain type of labor. Now let me define this for you. For instance, a nuclear scientist, research lab is the only organization that can hire nuclear scientists. Is making sense, right? So the idea here is, right, exactly. In this case, we'll talk about it. Absolutely, absolutely. Good observation. Good point, right? Absolutely, right? So, Abdullah, in this case, you'll talk about how the government has to respond to this monopsony, right? Because monopsony in this case is being very harmful for the workers. Also, I'll tell you, right? Absolutely, that's correct, right? So first of all, you define what monopsony is. Then you also gave an example of monopsony, labor market. So in monopsony labor market, for instance, there is a nuclear research lab. Now, normal businesses don't hire nuclear scientists. I mean, what's the point? I mean, you don't need anyone so, qualified or qualified in nuclear physics or something, right? You don't need such people, right? But let's say there's a nuclear research lab in a country that's making nuclear energy or nuclear bombs or whatever, I don't know, right? So that's the only company organization where this person can work. Fair enough, simple enough, right? Now that is a good example of a monopsony labor market. Now moving forward from here, right? Think about this. Monopsonist is exploitative and as it knows that it is the only employer for a certain labor, therefore it can afford to pay employees less and still retain them, right? Now, are you getting me what I'm trying to say here? So monopsony is exploitative towards that thing, right? Exploitative towards uh, employees. Why? Because what they know is that they are the only company where a certain type of labor can work, and even if they pay them less, those people cannot leave because they don't have any other alternate employment prospect, or they can't go and work in any other organization. Just like, I mean, unlike doctors and normal engineers and normal teachers. So let's say if Mega Lecture is one place where I'm working, and if Mega Lecture is not paying me as much as other schools or platforms are paying me, then I can, just switch and go to work for another platform and so on, right? But in case of nuclear scientists where there's a monopsony, I mean, that's not that easy. Are you getting me? To control monopsony, let's try to wrap this up. To control monopsony, the government would want to intervene and make laws protect labor rights. Therefore, in this case, it would be better if wage rate determination is not left to market forces. Are you getting me? Now, what I'm saying over here is trade unions can also fight back against monopsony that can attract government attention if they go on strike. Can also fight back against monopsony. Right, yeah, true. That's absolutely correct. Good point. Good point. Yeah. But again, in such a market, Abdullah, in such a market, perhaps people are afraid, employees are afraid to form a monopsony. Why? Because they know if they do that, the instant moment they might get fired and all that. And with not having any alternate, organization, no, not having any alternative to work for, um, can put them in a really difficult situation. Are you getting me? But in this case, definitely, the government would be really helpful if government intervenes and government make rules and regulations around that. This is making sense, right? Right? Okay. Now, this is what you need to say. Okay. Now, let's quickly sum this up. So the second question was asking about if labor market is imperfect, is the determination of wage rate still better left to that market? So you explained three cases of imperfection: government intervention, existence of trade unions, and monopsony. Now, in the first case where the government intervenes, right. Yeah. I'm just summing that up. So in the first case, when the government intervenes, it's better for the workers. Why? Because government gives them minimum wages, government provides them bare minimum or decent working conditions and all that stuff. So that's definitely beneficial for workers, right? They get better wages and all. But since that increases the cost of production because wages are higher and all for the workers, so they cut upon their output levels or so on. They cut upon their workers, and therefore the overall demand for labors can decrease with lower employment. So one good side, that people who are working get to earn higher wages, but bad side for bad thing, or negative consequence, in the sense that some people will lose their jobs. On the other hand, same happens when trade unions exist. So trade unions put pressure on the government, on the firms to pay them more, have better working conditions. So it's the good thing that sometimes their demands are being accepted, but in case their demands are not being accepted, then some people might lose their job, because again, hiring labor would be expensive. Then in the third case, monopsony. Now we said that monopsony is outrightly harmful for the economy. Why? Because since the company know that they are the only firm that can hire a certain type of labor, they exploit labor, they pay them less and all those things, right? And to fight that situation, the government has to step up. The government should step up to control that situation, right? So this is what the question is asking you to tell, that what imperfect labor market is, what happens, and what are your suggestions or recommendations, right? So, okay, so we'll stop here for today, Abdullah, and tomorrow we'll continue from here and we'll practice a couple of more questions regarding labor market. Is this good? Right? So I'll see you then. Take care and have a good night. Allah Hafiz.